This is Paul again, and welcome back to Maya Rockstars, where you become the Maya Rockstar. So, and again, I don't care if you like country music or something like that. I just use the term rockstar because we want to live a life in excess. So that's why, or just we want to be successful, right? We don't want to be starving artists because that sucks. So let's be successful at what we do and create some amazing stuff in Maya. I'm just going to show you how to really get started with Maya as quickly as possible. So if you watch the first two videos, you'll see that I have created this amazing egg shape or Tylenol or whatever you want to do it. It was really kind of just a squashed sphere. And now let's take a look at some of the other things we can create. So I'm going to go ahead and move this. So remember, we can use our transform tools. If I use my W key, if I select this guy here and move him out of the way, now I can start making some other things. So what I'd like to do is create a plane on the bottom here. Now, so far I've been creating Nurbs shapes. So if you go to create, I've been creating Nurbs. So for this next part here, it doesn't really matter if you create a polygon in Nurbs or a polygon primitive as a plane or a Nurbs primitive as a plane. We're going to just create a plane. So it doesn't really matter which one we use. I'll just go ahead and create the polygon one since we haven't hit that menu yet. And let's go ahead and say plane. And so it just plops this plane in the middle of the scene here. It has a transformation again because I have that tool selected, but if I want to go ahead and scale it, I'm going to type R. So I'm going to hit the R button, and then I can just click in the center and scale this up. So now I have an actual plane. The grid here that we see is not an actual plane. It's just a visual reference where you place all your objects. So right now we're just looking at placing things on top of this plane here so that when we do go and render it out, we will see objects sitting on a plane. So just as a reference, so far we've been doing everything in the Maya view. The Maya view uses hardware rendering, which is different than software rendering, which is what we're going to use later when we want to render out some really beautiful images. Now, that's not to say that you can't do really nice looking things in hardware rendering, but there are much fewer options, as you'll see when we get further into this. You've probably seen some amazing game art done in real-time 3D that has amazing looking materials and all sorts of things like that. But for the most part, there is a difference between hardware rendering and software rendering, and the workflow to create the imagery is a little bit different. We won't get into specifics on that just yet, but right now would just be aware that right now we're looking at a hardware render view, and later we'll talk about rendering in software. So right now let's take a look at this planar scene here, and we'll go ahead and create some more shapes. So, and you can play around with these menus. I'd say just go crazy and start making all kinds of different types of shapes. So I'll go ahead and create the cylinder shape, and you'll notice with the Nurbs, I created a Nurbs cylinder and it is open on the top and bottom. And I'll get back to that a little bit later, how you can cap that off. But right now I'm just going to place this guy over here and show you the difference that when I create a polygon cylinder, it will be slightly different. So it already comes in with a cap, you'll notice. And again, I'll explain how to do the cap on the Nurbs version in a second here. But we'll go over the sort of the grouping of these objects and how they're different. So right now we also want to be in hierarchy mode. So we want to select the very top of each object, and you'll see why in a second. So we'll go ahead and we're going to create maybe one of each of these things. So let's create a polygon sphere. So we already have a Nurb sphere, and you'll see that it looks a little bit different than the Nurb sphere here. And I'll scale that up by hitting the E key and put it right next to it. Let's get rid of this one for now, and let's put in comparison a Nurb sphere. Okay, so the Nurb sphere. So it looks less detailed for some reason, right? Just because it has less spans. But when you get up close to these guys, you're going to see some differences here in the way they display. So, the Nurbs has a little bit more flexibility when it comes to drawing out how smooth the object is in the end. You notice I don't need quite as many spans here to draw a smooth object as I do for the polygon, and you can actually see the polygon edges here. You can kind of see them here, but we don't really know where exactly they are when we look at the wireframe, because the wireframe doesn't have a one-to-one match where all the polygons are, whereas a polygon object does. And we'll get into the details of that later. So let's go ahead and create a Nurbs cube. And I'll scale that guy up. And then I will go ahead and create a polygon cube. And this is just shown up differently because whatever the last settings were on when I drew a cube, they're a little bit different. So I'll go over the settings on those in a second. So look at those. But visually, these really don't look any different. The cube Nurbs and the cube polygon. And you can go ahead and create some of these other things. I'd say just have fun with creating, the torus. There's another one. And go ahead and create a polygon. And there's also a polygon. So they have a lot more shapes here with a polygon, right? A pyramid. That's something you can't create as a Nurbs. So let's take a look at some of these now. But anyway, let's take a look at the cylinder. So the cylinder here is sort of enclosed while this is not capped off. So the difference really between Nurbs and polygons is, I like to think of Nurbs as like a sock. Well, more like a sock with a hole in it. There's always a hole on both sides of a Nurb. And if you look at like a torus, for example, even a torus would be a sweep, and then there would be a beginning and end, but sometimes they're attached together. But there's always sort of a hole on one end or the other that completes a Nurbs. Whereas with polygons, there really can be all the different points can be merged together, and you can do some various things that you can't necessarily do with Nurbs. Nurbs are a little bit easier to work with sometimes, and we'll get into the details of those later. But let's take a look at how we can now make the Nurbs look like the polygon. So if I go ahead and say create Nurbs, and then I say cylinder, I can pull up the option. So I pulled up that little square, and let me just show you that again. So if I got to create Nurbs, and see that little box there, every time there's a little box there, that means there's options that you can look at. So in this case, I'm going to say caps. So you hear where it says caps, you want to say on both. I want to say create and apply. So here's another difference between Nurbs and polygons, and we're going to look here in a second at what really the components are of these are. So they look identical. Well, not exactly. There's fewer spans on this, but those anyway, those can be changed too. You can change the number of spans to match these, but that's not the real difference. Same thing with the cube. You notice exactly the same looking geometry, but they are different. So, and I'll show you how they're different in the fact that the polygon object is a single object, whereas the Nurbs object here, that is a cylinder, had to be created with separate pieces. So the way that you can see those separate pieces is if you change from polygon, if you change from the hierarchy mode down to this selection mode where you can select by object, then you can kind of go in, and I'll deselect this, and you can see I can click on the top or the bottom. So I can click on various pieces of it. Now notice if I click on the main part of the cylinder, it selects the whole thing. That's because they're sort of parented. But if I click on the top here, since it's a child object, it is separate. And the same thing you'll notice with the bottom. So I can kind of destroy these objects by sort of taking them apart. And you'll notice the same thing with the cube, right? So the cube has separate pieces as a Nurb, and I can kind of just blow that apart. Whereas with the polygon, it's really a single object, okay? It's not a group of objects. It's just one object, okay? So that is basically the difference on the primitives level of, and sort of just an overview generally of polygons and Nurbs objects. And we'll get into more details on how to create more complicated objects and what the advantages are and disadvantages. But right now, let's as far as primitives go, this is as far as we really want to go with details. So let's move on to texturing.